I am a firm believer in the need to provide services. You know, that services without advocacy are not sustainable. But advocacy without services can be hollow, at least in the context of harm reduction. When you're talking about the need to literally save people's lives, as you're trying to work towards long-term transformational change, you need to do something today to save their lives. There is an activist named Raul. He's part of a group called Movimentos in Brazil, and he runs an organization as well. And he came to New York and was giving us a talk through a translator. And he said, when you white people talk about the war on drugs, you always talk about the drugs. But for me and my people, he's Afro-Brazilian, when we talk about the war on drugs, it's all about the war. And I knew that, but it was like he had, like, I don't know, it was electrifying, right? It's not about the drugs, it's about the war. In Mare, sometimes kids can only go to school, you know, they miss a third of their school year, something like that, because the schools are closed because the army is doing some kind of incursion into the neighborhood. So when they're talking about the war on drugs, it's a war on drugs here in the US too, and it is. And they're talking about that context, you know, that experience of gang-led and state-led violence. That means that their neighborhoods are literally war zones. And so what Raul was saying, you know, for us, it's all about the war, is that, you know, it's like, you know, we want to create safety for people who use drugs, but it's the same as creating safety for the whole neighborhood, because they're shooting down from the helicopter on all of us, just the same, right? So there's a way in which, you know, the safety of the person who uses drugs is intimately tied to the safety of the community. Or the, you know, the opposite, the lack of safety of the person who, you know, everybody is unsafe equally. And so harm reduction has to center community safety. Maybe around 2015, 2016, I had some experiences that we've talked about, some of them here, in other countries of the world, creating services and using services for advocacy and taking a broad view of services that were really about creating space in some ways for people. Like a lot of times it's just about creating a space where people are safe. That is the service. And I was like, I really want to do work on creating space for people who use drugs in the US, specifically on safe consumption sites, like safe drug use sites, safe injection facilities. We started funding advocacy for safe drug consumption rooms in several parts of the United States. Mostly we were at the time focusing in New York State, California, and Washington State. A lot of work in Seattle, actually. And that experience got me a toehold into working in the US. And eventually out of that grew a larger project, which we called, I think Jonathan named it, the Open Society Collaboration on Overdose in America. So we ended up in Ohio because there was a ballot initiative that Open Society US was around drugs, in fact, that they were trying to get passed. And because we were in Ohio was what was and still is one of the states with the highest rates of overdose death. It's high everywhere, but Ohio is sort of generally among the top 5. You know, and I was kind of looking for community groups to partner with, and we ended up in Portsmouth, Ohio, which is in Appalachian, Ohio. You know, in this little house, meeting with these people, including this wonderful woman who, you know, they were calling the Robin Hood of naloxone because she distributed more naloxone around Portsmouth to all her neighbors than anybody else. And it was this really ragtag group of people, loosely affiliated to this group called River Valley Organizing, that had been involved in the campaign for Issue 1, which was the ballot initiative. In a lot of places, especially where there isn't a lot else, church is the place where people go for support and for services. So we did a lot of work with faith-based groups, creating harm reduction liturgies, doing a whole naloxone saves lives thing where they put the naloxone on the altar and talk about harm reduction is what Jesus would do, and then went to the whole congregation, did a whole campaign on people who use drugs are beloved by God, which makes me like kind of tear up a little bit, even as a secular Canadian, because it's just so beautiful, right? And so this combination of there's a combination of services, strong policy advocacy, and then cultural relevance is what I would call it, like a way to talk to people through the institutions that they trust, which in many cases is their church, about why naloxone is something that the church should do, and caring about people who use drugs is something that the church should do. That's what's so, to me, important about a thing like a place like a safe consumption site isn't just that drugs can be used there. It's that people who use drugs can be there, right? Like, and they can be people who use drugs being there, right? You can take up space, you know, including the drug user part of you and the non-drug user, everything else that you are as a whole person, right? And we tend to really push active drug users out of space, like out of physical space, you know, out of neighborhoods. We don't let them in the door. Out of programmatic space, programs are created for people when they're ready to start abstinence, but not when they're still in their active drug use. Their policies, you know, are addressed at getting people off drugs, but not helping them while they're on drugs. In all, you know, so people have the right to exist. They have the right to remain alive. They have the right to exist, and they have the right to take up space. So those things aren't exactly articulated, you know, the way they are in, you know, any universal statements on human rights, but I think they're all pretty fundamental to an understanding of human rights.